First, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge and express our gratitude to Meredith and Kip Frey for supporting this lecture. Kip is among the law school's most distinguished graduates and one of our more involved. He earned his law degree from this law school in 1985, and since then has established himself as one of the country's leading startup CEOs with successes that are legendary among the new generation of entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. To name just a couple of examples, in 1999, Digital South magazine named Kip the top CEO in the Southeast, and the North Carolina Electronic and Information Technology Association named OpenSite, his company at the time, the software company of the year. He is chairman of the North Carolina Council for Entrepreneurial Development, which is the nation's largest entrepreneurial membership organization. And just last week, he was named to the board of directors of Nitronex Corporation, an emerging growth wireless communications company based in Raleigh. Together, Meredith and Kip have committed themselves to the Duke community. Kip is the professor of the practice at both Fuqua and at the law school. He regularly shares his professional knowledge and expertise with the business and law communities, including faculty and students. With Meredith, he has joined Duke, and particularly the law school, in efforts to establish innovative educational initiatives in entrepreneurial management and intellectual property that I think stand with the best in the country. Meredith and Kip, we take great pleasure in your company today. We acknowledge your contributions to our community and thank you for supporting this lectureship. I now want to introduce our own Professor James Boyle to introduce our featured guest.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to Kip and to Meredith, who, as Kate says, are not merely benefactors, but alums, friends, collaborators, colleagues. This is the second annual Frey Lecture. The first was given by Larry Lessig last year on the architecture of innovation. In that lecture, Larry laid out the heart of the argument in that was later published in book form in a book called The Future of Ideas quite recently, which has been acclaimed and reviewed very widely. One of Lessig's main contentions in that lecture, that intellectual property protection needs to be seen within the set of restraints that the Constitution sets up, and the set of restraints set up by the Bill of Rights, was clearly attended to by the Supreme Court because they recently granted cert in Eldred versus Ashcroft, a term challenging the Sonny Bono term extension statute. That case is brought by Lessig and others, and he actually described it at some length in that lecture. I'm saying all of this for Yochai's benefit because this has aroused on our part a certain expectation that out of every lecture will come at least one cert petition. We did initially have a plan for the lecture that I discussed with Kip and Meredith, that there ought to be an automatic fast track just from the Frey lectureship straight to the Supreme Court, just, grant cert immediately on the topic chosen by that lecturer for that day. That's still in the works, though, so that hasn't yet happened. Our lecturer today is Yochai Benkler, and we have a long-standing tradition in the introductions for the Frey lecture, a long-standing tradition from the time before which the memory of man runneth not, that we say practically nothing about the jobs that the distinguished lecturer has held or the important people or institutions for whom he has or she has worked, but rather focus on their ideas. So I will say to you that Yochai Benkler is a professor of law at New York University Law School, and leave it at that. Instead, we talk about their ideas, about their work. We chose Yochai with unanimity and enthusiasm as our second annual Frey lecture because of a real set of contributions, not just one contribution, but a set of contributions that he's made to intellectual property scholarship. He's one of the earliest scholars of his generation to insist that the Constitution did apply to intellectual property, despite the Supreme Court's occasional apparent reluctance to accept that conclusion. And he did so in particularly interesting and important ways. One of his first major pieces, Free as the Heir to Common Use, argued for the position that the norm of American law is the norm that was laid out in dissent by Justice Brandeis in International News Service versus Associated Press. Brandeis said, "The general rule of law is that the noblest of human productions, knowledge, truths ascertained, conceptions and ideas, become, after voluntary communication to others, free as the air to common use, Upon these incorporeal productions, the attribute of property is continued after such communication only in certain classes of cases where public policy has seemed to demand it. And Benkler argues that there are real restraints, both in the grants of power to Congress in the Copyright Patent Clause, and through the operation of the First Amendment over the extent and reach of intellectual property. What's more, he also took, and this was a genuine first, although it was the kind of first which, as soon as it's done, makes you think, why didn't I do that earlier? He took a number of cases from communications law, which had talked about the intersection between a technology and the First Amendment. Those were understood to be entirely different, and he wove them into the fabric of intellectual property law in a way that I think has genuinely transformed the field. In subsequent articles, all with great titles, Siren Songs and Amish Children is my own personal favorite, Yochai extended and deepened this body of work. But the constitutional aspect of his work is not the main thing that he's going to talk about today, at least I believe not. One way of explaining the focus of his talk today is that he's going to be talking about the real changes that the internet brings in the way that we interact and we create, and the significance of those changes for intellectual property and for democracy itself. Some of these ideas were laid out in an earlier piece, also with a great title, Coase's Penguin, or Linux and the Nature of the Firm, which is kind of a series of inside geek jokes, but nevertheless, very good ones, I have to say. A lot of popular writing on the internet is unbelievably shallow. I mean, shallower than a talk show host. It's a set of considerations of the technology in which there is actually nothing that the technology has added to the thing being discussed. You know, someone sent an email asking somebody else out on a date and then murdered her. Aha! An internet murder. You know, no, not an internet murder. Nothing to do with the internet. It might as well have been a phone call. It's the scandals, the discussions of cults that commit suicide, or the latest porn site. And these are shallow, and they don't deal with what's important or even just interesting about the internet. Benkler's work is remarkably salutary here, because what he focuses on is a sort of what's actually different and interesting about the process of creation over the internet, the stuff that it makes us understand in what we've already done, and what we always did in the way we always created, but the way that this has been brought into focus by the internet. But it also shows us new ways that we create and interact. But in another sense, Benkler's work is a sort of revisiting of a question that First Amendment and IP scholars have always worried about, which is how and why do people create? How is it that creation happens? How does the market or the law work to prevent or to encourage or to actually forbid their creativity? And Professor Benkler's lecture today, Freedom in the Commons Towards a Political Economy of Information, which I gather is going to form the introduction of a forthcoming book on the subject, so that's one down. We've got the book, just not the cert petition, is in one sense very modern. It deals with digital technologies and the impact of digital technologies. But in another sense, it's not so much modern as it is actually a turn back, a return to the past, to return and bypass the contemporary shallow language of economic analysis and efficiency and return to an older Scottish tradition exemplified by Adam Smith. That is to say, the tradition that doesn't just try and give us the narrow economics, but the political economy of our creativity, of our speech, and of our democracy. Yochai Benkler.
Thank you for the very gracious introduction. I'm deeply honored to have been invited here to this great law school, in this great university, in this great community of entrepreneurship, where some of the most interesting things, from my perspective as an observer of the transformation we are going through, are happening. It's particularly an honor to have been invited to a place that has, I believe, the most interesting and best intellectual property faculty. And the combination of David, Jerry, and Jamie is unparalleled in my mind in creativity and precision, in erudition and insight and practical engagement in the world. So I'm immensely honored and pleased to be here to talk to you about work that is in some sense a conclusion to things I've been doing over the past 5 or 6 years, and in some sense the beginning of new things. And the book that Jamie mentions is the one that for the past year and a half he's been pushing me to write, so hopefully it will actually happen now. So, fasten your seatbelts. Freedom in the Commons, or a Political Economy of Information. The focus of my talk today lies in 3 things, primarily the first 2. One is to identify 2 social aspects central to the emerging technological economic condition that I will call, at least for purposes of identification, the memetic economy. And these are non-market production and its rise, and radically decentralized production, whether market-based or not. I'll talk about how alternative modes of production, characterized by these 2 aspects, promise more robust fulfillment of the ideals of democracy, autonomy, and social justice. And finally, I'll identify the battle over the institutional ecology of information. That is to say, the set of laws that make different modes of production more or less likely to emerge and be sustainable in a society, and how that battle reflects upon the future of liberal societies. So let's start by looking at a moment of opportunity. We start by understanding that we are at the end, maybe, of a 150-year-long trend towards concentration and commercialization of information production and exchange. This starts with the introduction of mechanical presses and the telegraph, which at once extend the reach of communications media and the relevant social constituencies that they speak to, and at the same time raise the capital cost of being an effective communicator to a particular community or society. What happens with this extension of audience and increase of cost of being a speaker is that public discourse is adapted towards an increasingly one-way model with professional commercial speakers and relatively passive recipients. This model then becomes quite easily adapted during the 20th century to radio, television, etc., and typifies the information environment of the 20th century. Now, the internet represents an opportunity for a radical reversal of this trend. And this is so because it extends its reach not by increasing capital in a centralized transmission facility, but by radically distributing the capital cost of communication. And so what we see is a pattern of diffuse capital infrastructure. I am now connected with my PC through infrastructure that is owned by this university, diffuse even to the level that components are owned, quite substantial components are owned by end users. The fundamental distinction that one sees between televisions on one hand and the broadcast network facilities or the cable head end on the other, stark, complete, is not the same when one looks at the internet, when one looks at a heavily processor-based, relatively cheap processor-based system where the end user computers and some of the servers, some of the routers along the way are not fundamentally different as capital inputs. What this does, this particular fact about the capital structure of communications, what this does is it brings us into a moment where human beings, rather than capital, can become the central organizing principle of our communications environment and our system of information production and exchange. And having stated that, I'll start to explain what that might mean. So, what is this technological economic condition that I'm suggesting to you one might call the memetic economy? I think of it as a new stage in what more commonly has been called the information economy. And it is combined of these two factors. The first is radical decentralization of intelligence in our communications networks. That is, networks where the edges are intelligent and the core is relatively stupid. And the increasing centrality of this particular object of production, information, knowledge, culture, to our overall economic activity. And it's the combination of these two things that creates the possibility of a new stage in the information economy. So what is the old stage before we talk about the new stage? The old stage is an information economy that arises to resolve a control crisis created by the 19th century. And if anyone wants one volume to read on this, it's called The Control Revolution from 1986 by James Beninger. And the basic problem is, as our production capabilities dramatically increase, as the scale and scope of society capable of being served by manufacture increases, and distribution networks grow to fit that, we get a dramatic difficulty, a crisis in how to control all these material processes and all the social processes that go into manufacturing and consumption of this new production activity. What we see in the emergence of the telegraph, in the emergence of advertising, in the emergence of accounting, in the emergence of a variety of technologies of information production and exchange, is a concentrated effort to solve this control crisis. The result is an information economy primarily focused on generating information usable for control. And what we see in the cultural aspect of the same economy, in Hollywood, in the recording industry, in the broadcast industry, is a parallel mind frame of industrial manufacture of information to control the social processes of its consumption, the star system, the distribution system. Now, one can treat this stage, instead of calling it the information economy, and thinking about the big five recording companies, accounting firms, doesn't really matter, as the industrial information economy. Now, what is this new stage that I'm at least experimenting with calling the memetic economy? The idea of a meme, Richard Dawkins creates it as an attempt to create an evolutionary or biology modeled concept of culture. But the basic use that I make of it here is, one, meme is a unit of cultural transmission. Primarily through reproduction by imitation is the primary vector of transmission, but fundamentally a unit of cultural transmission, whether we call it information because it has some specific uncertainty reducing characteristic related to action, whether we call it knowledge because it has some organizing function with regard to information, whether we call it culture because we don't quite know how it relates to action, but nonetheless we know that it is central to our understandings of ourselves in our environment. All of these are memes, are units of cultural transmission. And what we could think of them is as a component or the primary element of a new stage. One might parallel it to the post-industrial. There's literature about the post-industrial society that to some extent relates to information production, but mostly relates to the breakup of the large-scale, mass-produced Ford to smaller, customized, etc., models of organizing production. Here we see, with regard to information, the possibility of the emergence of a parallel second stage, just as we saw in the physical economy, a second post-industrial or post-Fordist model. And the idea is, and this is the main reason why I'm experimenting with using this term, the memetic economy, is that the production of cultural units shifts to replicating much more closely the complex and diverse mechanisms of cultural exchange we have in society generally, rather than the industrial model that typified the 20th century. So it's descriptive in the sense that it is generalizing to all things cultural information knowledge, and that the direction is towards a much more radically distributed model of information production and exchange, closer to our general social practices of cultural reproduction than to the much narrower phenomenon of the 19th and 20th century of industrial information production. What this does, as a practical matter at the core of the political implications, is that it creates the possibility for reversing the control focus of the industrial information economy. In other words, the mechanism that I'm talking about is that concentration and commercialization were the central mechanisms for structuring the industrial information economy onto control. A relatively small number of manufacturers of information keeping relatively tight control as a point of control, and commercialized because focused in the interest of controlling a crisis created by increased productivity through a move to a system of market-based industrial production. So, some basic economics of the possibility of the transition. To begin with, we have some of the standard problems one sees with information production, basic economics of intellectual property. Most important here are the fact that information is a public good, and here the primary focus is on the non-rivalry of information. That is to say, the fact that once a scientist has generated a fact given the internal norms of science, once Tolstoy sits down and writes War and Peace, whether 1 million people know it, 10 million or 1, Tolstoy doesn't need to sit and write the manuscript over again. The scientist doesn't need to run the experiment again. The use of information is non-rival in the sense that no social cost is incurred for the marginal user. Given that mainstream welfare economics places its primary importance of understanding what efficient production is on the fact, if it is there, that goods are priced at their marginal cost, you see that there's a fundamental, irreducible problem with intellectual property if we have a good that we only know that it is efficiently produced and consumed if it is priced at its marginal cost, which is 0. And we know that market-based producers do not produce in expectation of giving things away for free. Okay, so this is a fundamental, irreducible problem of treating information production in purely market-based terms. It's not one that's foreign to economics. It's originally identified by Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow in 1962. But it fundamentally identifies information as a public good, not as a political term, but in the technical economic sense. The other effect is on the shoulders of giants, evoking Newton's statement that we see as far as we do because we are like dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants, or relating to the fact that information is not only an output of its production process, it is one of the core inputs. This makes things particularly difficult for purely property-based production, because if the initial recuperation from the public goods problem is, yes, on a static analysis, we would only have it efficiently if it priced at 0, but on a dynamic analysis, in the future, if we create some price, over time we'll get more production because of the incentives. The on the shoulders of giants effect modifies that statement in the sense that tomorrow's information producers are also underutilizing information as an input. So dynamically, as well as statically, we have a real problem with information production relying purely on market-based production. What this means is essentially is that some non-market, non-proprietary production is necessary within our standard economic models to maintain efficient information production, how much is extremely difficult to identify, and highly context dependent. Each industry, in effect, is different, and what few empirical studies we have from patent would suggest is that short of the pharmaceuticals, Hollywood, and the recording industry, there aren't too many contexts in which it is very, very important or very, very efficient to have purely proprietary-based production. So this is the baseline problem. Now, what's added by the introduction of low-cost processors and ubiquitous network connections is that we begin to isolate human creative inputs as the central inputs into information production. If you just look at this basic description of the economics of information production, it's a simple statement. The benefits acquired through direct appropriation, that is to say, sale of a license to use something which, based on a legal right, you can exclude people from using. Benefits from indirect appropriation, that is to say, appropriating through any means other than exerting a property right, which is to say service contracts, reputation, pleasure, you name it, have to be greater than the cost of human capital inputs, the cost of existing information, which is an input as well as an output, and the cost of communication, which is combined from the cost of fixation and the cost of transmission. The cost of taking the thing called information, turning it from an experience into something that can be transmitted over distance and time to other people. Now, what we see with the internet economy, with the internet, is the dramatic reduction of the cost of fixation and transmission, the cost of communication, a potential threat to the possibility of acquisition of the benefits, of the direct appropriation of benefits. And what remains the question is how high the cost of existing information will be. Will it be driven to marginal cost by essentially impossibility of exclusion? What the cost of human capital is, given that you can connect everyone to everyone else in very small increments at any time. And can these be greater, can these be smaller than the benefits of indirect appropriation, be they reputation, pleasure, social relations, or service contracts, sale of widgets that's associated with the information, all the things we know from the literature on free software as potential ways for market-based appropriation that is not property-based, that is not direct appropriation. What we see from this is that the cost of information becomes the central battleground over how sustainable a model that relies on the cost of human capital being covered by indirect appropriation, by some means other than property. And this is where the enclosure movement battle that I will just mention towards the end is happening. It's because of this change. Now, human beings in this equation are central or become central once the cost of capital declines, not because of characteristics that made labor in the Taylorist or Fordist model. That is to say, you needed someone to stand and tweak a lever somewhere. They are there because of things that human beings differ in fundamentally and diversely. Because of creativity, because of wisdom, because of taste, because of experience. Things that people acquire over life by living and being who they are in their culture. Things that make them non-fungible. Things that are central later to understanding why it is that when you move to an economy based on human creativity, setting up systems that are not market-based, setting up systems that allow people to choose what they participate in, creates tremendous social welfare. And that's really the subject of this paper, Koza's Penguin, that Jamie mentioned, and of a couple of chapters in this book, but not what I want to focus on today. I'll be happy to talk about that in questions if we want to. What we see is that individual human beings live social life through pervasive making and exchange of memes. And what the memetic economy can do, and remember, one component of the memetic economy is to say information production is at the core not the periphery of the economy, is to take these social practices that we have generally been able to treat as peripheral to economic activity and bring them straight to the core. And given the importance of productivity and the importance of economic activity to our conception of the relative importance of social practices, it enables us to imagine the importance of social relations that are not market-based, that are not managerial hierarchy firm-based, as much more important than our public discourse today allows them to be. This brings us to the problem of the organization of production and how it changes with the introduction of the memetic economy. At baseline, the physical economy settled on two modes of production, an observation that goes back to Ronald Coase in a piece called The Nature of the Firm from the 1930s. And those are largely markets, that is to say, decentralized production coordinated through price signals, and managerial hierarchies, that is to say, coordinated by command givers to order followers. In this economy, most people live most of their productive life by following orders, because most people do not coordinate their productive activities through markets, but rather firms interact through markets and individuals act within firms. And most people within their consumption realm, a lot of the rest of their lives, follow a life of consuming from menus of goods determined by managerial decisions as the things to be produced, and then sold through an advertising system, a demand management system, so that people will have a set of cluster of preferences that fit these production decisions. Okay. Relatively constrained in terms of day-to-day choice. What we see in the memetic economy are two emerging phenomena. First is the increasing role for non-market information producers. These aren't necessarily decentralized or radically distributed. So first of all, non-market behavior is much more important in the information economy, even the industrial information economy, than it is in contemporary understandings of the physical economy. That is to say, we don't have non-profit production of automobiles. And yet we have centrally important non-profit production of things like news. So academic science, PBS, consumer reports, they are very important already. What we see that is central is that lower publication costs and wider reach increase the number of such organizations that can be efficacious and the overall effectiveness of this entire sector. And let me just give you a couple of examples of what I mean. So, just run a Google search of presidential debates, and you'll see a very different diversity of organizations than we see through the traditional media of the 20th century. To begin with, the Commission on Presidential Debates, the organization itself, rather than one of the network broadcasters, is right at the top. Then we have a variety of organizations, various .orgs. It's not that we don't see, we see a little bit of academic analysis. It's not that we don't see any commercial production, right? We see C-SPAN, a nonprofit created by the cable operators. We see CNN All Politics, right around 9 among the sources. But the concept that there is a universe in which CNN and C-SPAN are part and not necessarily the most important part of the first information environment we interact with, assuming that this becomes the first information environment relative to the broadcast model. This is what I mean by saying an increased role for non-market production. Another example, not only about the larger number of efficacious producers, but also the effectiveness, is something I ran this morning, which is the archive of what democracynet.org, the League of Women Voters site, created for the city council elections in Raleigh for 2001. And what you see as compared to, say, the local news is a facility that allows individuals to post questions in writing to the candidates, a facility for the candidates to respond to, for example, so you get all of them responding to the question of living wage ordinance and should you or shouldn't you have it. And you know, it's not pages on pages. It might be a line or two. Some of them might produce more. On question of whether or not you'd support a living wage ordinance. And you actually see the difference between the candidates, those that won and those who wouldn't won, and the specific arguments at some level. It's worthwhile going and seeing. The point here is an organization, a nonprofit organization, capable, because of the low cost, of providing richer information down to the level of council elections, specific council members, than anything we've gotten from the commercial broadcast media. So an increase in the number of efficacious non-market producers and an increase in the effectiveness of non-market producers. So that's the beginning of the important growth of non-market production. What we also see that seems much more radically new is the emergence of large-scale commons-based peer production. Now, it's not 100% new. Science is basically built on production that is by many people contributing incremental contributions, not operating on market signals, not being given their research marching orders by their dean, deciding what to research, bringing their collaboration together, creating science. All of this is there already in science. The Oxford English Dictionary, created in roughly the same way in the 19th century, very laboriously and over years. But what we see in this context is a dramatic increase in the importance and the centrality to the possibility of information production on the net. Free software brings this to the fore, but we also see peer production emerging all around. So free software, in this case, if you just look at Apache market share from 95 to 2001, dramatic increase, right? Free software overcoming in something that's quite central to the commercial sustainability of sites. This is not a question of, for a few $1,000s of cost, you will or won't adopt a particular application. How effective will the server software be that runs your site? And yet, in this market, we see tremendous adoption of software produced by peer production, not through the market. Similarly, Linux, again, capturing large market share of operating systems connected to the net. It's becoming difficult to ignore the practical success of free software. And this requires interesting questions. That's all I want to say about free software, because actually what I want to say is much broader. And what's much broader is that this notion of peer production is not limited to software. It is the general social phenomenon of variously sized collections of individuals effectively producing information goods without price signals and without managerial commands. And we see it happening all around. The web itself, go to Google, plug in any search request. The information didn't exist before, now it exists on your search page. And how was it produced? One nonprofit, another person who's a hobbyist, a third company that has its business model to give some of the information away for free. All sorts of groups, individuals, small and large, combine on your Google results page to provide you the information you wanted. But we also see these things on less diffuse levels. We see them in very specific situations. So Mars Clickworkers, an experiment of NASA that allowed 85,000 people to collaborate on mapping Mars craters. They took the images, they mapped the craters, and after 6 months when they did an analysis comparing these to the outcomes of the trained PhDs that they had used before, they described the outcomes as practically indistinguishable, including situations where you had 56 art students coming and doing concentric circles as an art project, and still that was averaged out by the number of people who could contribute small contributions. Multiplayer, massive multiplayer online games. If you just think of tens of thousands of people or thousands of people playing a game, telling a story together, instead of going to the movie and receiving the story as a finished good. If you compare Wikipedia, a distributed produced encyclopedia, to say encyclopedia.com, this is an example I want to give you. So here's encyclopedia.com from the Columbia Encyclopedia. Copyright, right granted by statute to the author or originator. You see there's a bit of an analysis here. There'll be some discussion of the Berne Convention, for example. You know, encyclopedia. What do we see when we go to Wikipedia for the same thing? Again, we see some discussion. A copyright discussion. One might agree or disagree, as one might as a professional with any short encyclopedia definition. But it's there, it's plausible, it may even be better. It's collaborative in the sense that one person puts it up in Wiki, opening it up for other things. So for example, here the author says, we should probably have a first sale doctrine separate entry, but I don't have time to do it. So they'll put in the first sale doctrine with a question mark, inviting somebody to come and contribute a separate entry into first sale doctrine, right? Collaboratively produced as volunteers of encyclopedic knowledge. It's just as good. But there's all this stuff. How are you going to know what's good, right? What creates relevance? And we see relevance and accreditation also happening through distributed peer-produced models. So we see volunteer models like the Open Directory Project or Slashdot. Again, let me just give you a feel. Here's what Yahoo has to list for internet-related law journals, right? 3 internet law journals: the Journal of Online Law and Pike and Fisher Internet Law and Regulation. Here's what the 30,000 or so volunteers of DMOZ, of the Open Directory Project, which is roughly the equivalent of Yahoo, but done by volunteers instead of by paid people, think are online journals of law and technology. Relevance and accreditation through the market. Slashdot is another extremely sophisticated example of how relevance is manufactured by people essentially voting and commenting on each other, doing peer review, not in a small group of academics, but among 250,000 users. So this Friday, for example, there was some discussion of something near and dear to the hearts of some people here, the SSSCA, a version of the DMCA that would effectively require all hardware to be designed so that it can enforce intellectual property rights or permissions imposed by intellectual property owners. And we see a post early on describing some sources that describes what happens. And then over the next 2 days, how many comments are created? 792 as of now. Different people commenting on this story of the SSSCA. Well, how do you know which of these 792 you want to read? Well, one thing I did was rank them, was organize them by the order in which they are ranked by the peer reviewers, by the users who say this is good or not good, up or down. Not that one person says it's up or down, but 10, 15, 25, 3 vote, and it goes up or it goes down. And we see quite interesting things. So, for example, we see a list of things you ought to take into consideration in writing your congressperson that they should oppose this bill, including strategic things. If your congress critter is a Democrat, do this. If your congress critter is a Republican, do that. And then continued discussions about whether this makes sense or not. Should it be typed? Should it be handwritten? Again, organized in terms of how good or useful the conversation is, based on peer review of these systems. And then you see some quotation from the article discussing this and the question of should we be talking about outlawing fair use when in fact what they try to do is not outlaw fair use, or should we be focusing on privacy? What's the thing to put in the letter? How do we analyze? This is 250,000 people. Can you imagine this as a medium in the broadcast system? But again, how do we know what's good? Radically distributed production. Now, what's the baseline? What's the comparison? Actually, what we see is that relevance and accreditation is not used only in volunteer systems, but is also incorporated into commercial systems. That is to say, Google, for example, ranks based on votes, as it were, from widely distributed websites that point towards a website. The more websites point towards you, the more other people think it's worthwhile visiting so that they put a link to you, the higher up you are. So again, accreditation occurs on a widely distributed model being produced by people doing it because they're putting on their website. As compared, for example, to Overture, or what used to be GoTo.com, which is a website that has the exactly opposite conclusion. You rank sites based on how much they pay the search engine. So, right, we have an experiment. The market, whoever pays more for placement, versus distributed voting. How do these look? So here's what Google produces for Barbie. We see Barbie.com, activities and game for girls online. That's up there. We see Barbie, Barbie dolls, etc. But very quickly we start seeing AdiosBarbie.com, a body image site for every body. We see more Barbie collectibles, but we also see armed and dangerous, extra abrasive, hacking Barbie with the Barbie Liberation Organization. We see the distorted Barbie. We see all sorts of things trying to play with Barbie, right? What happens when we move to the site used by the Disney site, which is to say we run the same search on the search engine produced by the site owned by Disney, go.com. And the answer is we get Barbies, new and pre-owned at NetDoll, Party Tech, your wholesale party store, toys for all ages at Amazon.com, and it goes on, buy collectible online, new. This is not necessarily better, and it certainly isn't normatively neutral. Different things come from when the market creates relevance and when volunteers create relevance, or when people vote on what they think is most important to them. By the way, very similar things happen when you run Barbie on the Open Directory project and and Yahoo. I'll just give you a quick sense. No, I won't. Okay, so the same thing happens in distribution, and I won't go into this in much detail as well. Now, why do we care? What are the stakes for liberal society? Imagine that you were to map liberal societies relative to each other along vectors of how well they fulfill, how central to their social practices, core liberal values of autonomy, democracy, and social justice are actually lived. You could imagine Saudi Arabia perhaps somewhere close to the origin, and you could imagine the US and Germany being placed elsewhere, with the US higher up on autonomy, both of them roughly equivalent on the third, imagine depth, I'm not very good at this, on the dimension of democracy, though in different ways, and Germany farther out on social democracy. Plausible ways of being a liberal democracy mapped on this three-dimensional grid of these three core values. Now, the thing to realize is that in practical political debate, productivity creates an efficient limit on the political imagination, on the possibility of pragmatic fulfillment of different values. We are not going to go towards democratic wheat production because we want to eat bread. And we have severe limits in the United States in particular on the notion of social justice, heavily justified in terms of productivity. Productivity sets an efficient limit on the political imagination. Now, if it is the case, as I will suggest to you in the remainder of the talk, that one, proprietary and market-based production have systematically dampening effects on democracy, autonomy, and social justice. Two, non-proprietary and commons-based, as well as non-market production, alleviate these dampening effects. And three, productivity can be sustained with non-proprietary and non-market production. Then two things follow. First, the memetic economy, if permitted to emerge from the institutional battle, enables an outward shift of the limits that productivity places on the political imagination. And two, a society committed to any combination of the three values needs to adopt robust policies to facilitate these modes of production, because they are not about selecting between productivity and liberal values, and it is not about selecting as among these liberal values. It is about extending the efficient boundary on how we can fulfill, on what is the plausible set of political arguments we can have given the constraints of productivity. So, democracy, autonomy, and social justice, and why ought we care about them? Democracy is combined essentially, in my mind, of two things: political democratic discourse and cultural democracy. Political democratic discourse is the relatively best known critique of these. We have it from the mass media, the critiques of mass media, both commercial and concentrated. One most important aspect is the concern that owners control information flow in a democracy and have disproportionate power. Hara Jonas of IDT made the mistake, I think, of saying quite explicitly in an interview with the New York Times not long ago, "Sure, I want to be the biggest telecom company in the world, but it's just a commodity. I want to be able to form opinion. By controlling the pipe, you can eventually get control of the content." Right? So that's the concern. The other concern is that, no, people are just out to make money, and then there are a series of fairly well-known critiques of what happens when people produce information just in order to make money, try to capture the greatest number of eyeballs, limit the stuff that's unpleasant, make things more bland and closer to the norm. We have positive political economic feedbacks in the sense that when you have a series of players in a democracy that have a very close relationship with legislatures and are the primary avenue for public recognition, they generate more legislation that's favorable to them, making them more powerful, etc. Intellectually, one of the things you start seeing is glorification of elitist conceptions as substitutes for genuine collective self-determination. Jamie yesterday at dinner was talking about reading an op-ed from Cokie Roberts, which was basically describing all these new things people do. They go out, they read information for themselves, they get reports from the FDA, from the FTC, from this. This is terrible, because we report that. How are they going to know how to deal with this information without our interpretation? Right? A conception of democracy that is highly elitist. Generally speaking, not all conceptions of democracy are helped by radical decentralization and extensive non-market production, but certainly conceptions of liberal pluralism that suggest that the way democracy works is by lots of communities, each understanding its own interests best and then coming together in some mobilized forum to trade, is established much more effectively by wide distribution of information production than otherwise, as well as a variety of liberal, as compared to Republican, discourse-oriented theories. Basically, if you think Habermas in various forms, if you think a variety of other liberal theories, the basic point is, if democracy is about people being able to talk to each other under conditions where no one dominates the conversation, then a system that allows anyone, whether market or non-market, large or small, to set up a conversation, to participate in a conversation with like-minded people and with others, is substantially better from a democratic perspective than a system that has to rely on a proxy of the conversation on the screen between the talking heads, or for that matter, the experts and the elites. Cultural democracy sometimes has been described as central to the cultural studies of media, and again, relatively familiar. In the context of intellectual property, we've seen it under the rubric of meaning-making processes, or using John Fiske's term, semiotic democracy. Few people, if any, have written about it as well and wonderfully as Jamie. We have the cases with regard to the Disney Air Pirates, the Gay Olympics case, the things we saw about Barbie, right? What is the meaning of Barbie depends on different interpretations one can access of it, and that is affected by how people can or cannot use. So this is the notion of the extent to which people can participate in forming the cultural meaning of their society, not through political processes, but through talking to each other. With regard to autonomy, there are general arguments that apply more or less to any of the many diverse conceptions of autonomy, and there are substantive. The main issues are the extent of the opportunities to control the information environment of others. That is to say, when I turn on my window to the world, how important am I to what I see through that window? Have I designed it to fit my own interests, ambitions, conceptions? Or is the window designed to keep my eyes on the designer's prize? That is central to autonomy, because that is a point at which manipulation can occur, at which one person, the owner, can focus the eyes of another to make the other act as the person writing the window would like them to act. Central to democracy. And the other is just an application to autonomy of what we saw with regard to democracy. That is to say, the more critical views one sees of life, the more one's choices, even if they are to live one's life as a mainstream life, are one's own, as opposed to given by conditions. And if you think I'm talking nonsense, there's this wonderful little quote from a 1999 white paper by Cisco, intended for broadband providers to tell them why it is that they should use this particular router called a policy router. You could restrict the incoming push broadcast as well as subscribers, outgoing access to the push site to discourage its use. At the same time, you could promote your own or partner services with full-speed features to encourage adoption of your services. Right? This is not critique. This is a selling point. There are substantive conceptions of autonomy, and I won't go into them now too deeply. Conceptions that say what is central about autonomy is how much of your life is self-governed. And how much of your life doesn't only mean in the abstract. It means in the day-to-day, in the things you do in your day-to-day. When you're a consumer, are you passively selecting from a very clear menu? Or is your conception of the time that we usually think of as consumption one in which you use your environment? You are an active agent in your environment. The same is true. There's a whole lot of literature about workplace democracy and the extent to which democracy can occur in life. Again, if people spend more of their productive time in a context where they order themselves, where they allocate their own labor, where they decide what to do and how to do based on how good they are at a particular thing, that is another dimension of life in which they can be autonomous. Justice, in a sense, is the most complicated to be very optimistic about. Hunger and disease, this won't solve. I mean, there is a Amartya Sen's argument that serious famines never happen in democracies, and maybe to that extent an aspect of democracy is to eliminate hunger or to solve justice. There is a concern that this is in some sense freedom for a small group of people, but I think that this is short-sighted in terms of technical literacy. I'll try anyway. And I'd say there's a liberal theories of justice component and a social democratic theory of equality component. When we talk about liberal theories of justice, the easiest to see are through those of John Rawls and the difference principle, which is very simple, this radical idea that one should organize social relations so as to make the least fortunate in society as well off as they can be. Again, if we say productivity won't be lost by a shift to non-market production, but the products of that non-market production are available for free for all, then it's not only efficiency, not only the economic analysis that says zero marginal cost pricing, that is to say zero in the context of information, it is justice on this conception that says you may not increase intellectual property, you may not increase the barriers to non-market production as long as you can sustain productivity through non-market production. Bruce Ackerman has a system of understanding social justice that is even better suited to explain why this matters. And primarily, he thinks about people being able to go out and engage the world, not burdened by differences in endowment that cannot be explained on neutral grounds. And wealth, inherited wealth, is a classic example of differences in endowment that cannot be explained. So here, what do we have? We have a set of productive resources that is available to anyone to come to and say, here, I can produce something with these materials. They're available for free. It doesn't matter that I am poor. Ability to plan your life and live your life not based on limitations on wealth endowment, as well as transactional capabilities. In other words, it's not that because I can purchase better information from a particular set of analysts that I can transact better. There are some mechanisms open to all. These are the potential advantages to justice in a liberal framework. From the perspective of social democratic equality, that is to say, not formal equality with some redistribution, but rather trying to actually achieve a particular set of core goods being available universally. So one can see availability from non-market resources at low cost could obviously help that, as well as even from market creators. If we increase competition and push towards marginal cost pricing in this context, of course we get tremendous distributional values, although this is a, shall we say, unorthodox social democratic argument to say, let's deregulate and let competition happen, which is essentially the claim here. Most valuable potentially is that increased availability of productive resources in capital-poor peripheries. That is to say, if Linux becomes something that enables engineers from the third world to come in and contribute and become part of the core economy, that is a central moment of redistribution in terms of social justice, not within a society, but around society, and can be replicated within a society as well. So these are the ways in which I see justice potentially being affected. Okay, so the memetic economy enabling much more powerful non-market production, the industrial economy controlling much more, the potential of non-market production and radically decentralized production to increase our practicing of the values of democracy, autonomy, and social justice. Is there a conflict between these? Is there a conflict, in some sense, between commercial concentrated production and radically decentralized production that we see? And the answer is yes. And the answer is essentially strong property rights in information are the point at which the industrial giants that built up around the industrial information economy can keep control. Radical decentralization is a threat to it and is substantially enhanced by low-cost access to information. And the core battleground is the cost of existing information, culture, and knowledge. And that battleground is played out in the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement, identified first by David in the public domain argument, written about tremendously by Jamie, a series of works, of moves in the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the SSSCA, the Uniform Computers Information Transactions Act, the move to trademark dilution, the move to software and business methods, database protection, which no one has written about more than Jerry and has explained the problems with it more lucidly and completely. The move to creating all sorts of common law doctrines regarding linking and trespass to chattels. Copyright itself, term extension, RAM copies, the emerging right to read, the shift to criminalization, because when you move to a memetic economy where everyone can potentially be a competitor because everyone undermines your move, the only way to control an entire population is through criminal law. So we move to criminalization, because you have to control an entire population's cultural practices in order to sustain the industrial giants of yore. This is the enclosure movement. It is the main institutional battleground. What we're left with is the task of building the commons for the digitally networked environment. An open set of resources, a core common infrastructure that will be available to all, for all to use as the basis on which we build our own productive enterprises, both market and non-market. At the physical layer, through the emergence of license-free spectrum and public provisioning of infrastructure, things we talked about yesterday in the panel on the future of the FCC. At the logical layer, that is to say the software that translates humanly meaningful communication and transmits it over the physical systems that allow us to communicate. We need to reverse the outcomes of the enclosure movement. We need to create something like a national software foundation, like the National Science Foundation. We need to adjust government procurement practices, as, for example, Germany has to require that all software written for the government must be GPL'd. A series of both deregulation in order to permit wide access to these information resources and public provisioning. And at the content layer, we need to resist the enclosure movement and reclaim the public domain. And in no place can I say this as robustly and clearly as I can here, because there is no place I know of more dedicated to the intellectual and practical pursuit of this goal. And it's not an abstract position, it's very real in terms of legal, intellectual, and political work. We are standing at a moment of potential transformation. How we shall be in this future, how we shall live through democracy, how we shall live as autonomous individuals, how we shall live as a just society, will in some measure be determined over the next 10, 20 years in a series of political battles that we are seeing now and that we will continue to see in terms of how open our information environment will be for anyone to be a producer of information, a participant in a cultural community. Allowing the winners of yesterday's economy to dictate the terms is economically disastrous. Permitting them to determine how we shall be free, productive human beings and citizens in a society based on this conception that they know what is best is unforgivable. Thank you.